Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me. I'm excited to announce that I just published my fourth book. It's something called The Delicate Art of Bureaucracy, Digital Transformation with the Monkey, the Razor, and the Sumo Wrestler. Like the rest of my books, it's about something that I think we all should be talking about, but for some reason we're not. Each time I've written a book, I've thought to myself, why hasn't anybody else written about this? I even in this case, I'm not too sure why. I'm not sure why nobody's written a book about how to use a monkey, a razor, and a sumo wrestler to defeat bureaucracy. But I'll come back to bureaucracy in a few minutes. First, I want to say something about an earlier book of mine, which seems to be stimulating a lot of discussion these days. It's a book I wrote about business value, the art of business value, and it's simply about what business value means. I wrote that book because everyone seemed to be talking about business value, especially in the agile software development world. And I wasn't too sure if people really were thinking about what the term means. I suspected that a lot of people had wrong ideas about it. And I suspected that partly because I went to a business school and did an MBA, and I know we never really talked about business value. That term was really never used. Yet, in the agile world, people are often talking about things like prioritizing work based on business value, on not delivering according to schedules and milestones, but making sure they were delivering business value, things like that. So it seemed to me that this term, business value, was quite an important thing. And maybe people were making assumptions about it that weren't really the right ones. And maybe understanding it well would change the way that we would practice agile software delivery. So what I know from thinking about it from my MBA program, the term business value isn't really well defined, right? It's a term that we throw around. And my worry was that IT teams, IT organizations were sort of deflecting the question of what it means to the rest of the business. Sort of figuring that it's not IT's job to figure out what adds business value or what business value means. It's somebody else in the business. In fact, in Scrum, for example, you have somebody called the product owner who's specifically responsible for making business value decisions. And that product owner is usually drawn from the business side of the organization. So I think it's very possible that the agile world, to a large extent, is accepting that certain things deliver business value, or accepting certain notions of business value, without really thinking deeply about whether those things really do, and whether business value is actually being delivered or just features and capabilities. Now, a lot of people associate the term return on investment with business value. In fact, informally, not thinking deeply about it, we probably tend to assume that what we mean by business value is something like a return on investment. Now, I think there are two questions to answer. The first is, well, is it? Is business value the same as return on investment? The second thing is, well, what do we mean by return on investment anyway? Because it turns out that return on investment is also not defined all that precisely. So by definition, return on investment is a return divided by the amount invested. But what do we mean by the return exactly? How do we measure a return? Well, often profit, not profit per se, but incremental profit, really. The profit that's the increase in profit that's going to come from deploying this IT system, right? So that assumes that you can sort of separate the new profit from the old profit. Do we mean 1 year of that increased profit, or 4 years, 10 years, 100 years, eternity? What if a competitor copies our product in a couple of years? in that case, does the return on our investment mean the return that we would have gotten if that competitor hadn't copied our product? Or does it mean that decreased return that we're actually going to get because the competitor copied our product? The term, using profit as our gauge of return has a couple of other problems. Profit is an accounting concept. It depends on a lot of things, like, for example, how you value your inventories, what expenses get capitalized, how assets are depreciating. Probably cash flow would be better than profit, but maybe a little bit more complicated to ascertain. So let's say that we're talking about a return on investment that is incremental profits, maybe adjusted by a rate of return, and that divided by the investment we make. Okay. Now, we're not really, when we make IT prioritization decisions or investment decisions, we're not really talking about return on investment, right? We're talking about projected return on investment, and that's kind of a different thing, right? How do we know what return to project when we're in the process of building an IT system? How do we know what those incremental profits are going to be, given that they're sometime in the future? Well, I think the way that we usually figure it out is we guess. I know in the CFO's organization, they use a different word for it, but ultimately it's a guess about the future, maybe made with a lot of information, maybe made with less information. These days in the digital economy, where things change really fast and where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of complexity, it's harder to make those guesses, or it's not harder to make the guess, it's harder to make it accurate or to, be sure that it's accurate. As I said before, maybe a competitor will copy the product. We don't know if a pandemic is going to shut us down. We don't know if somebody is going to release a viable quantum computer and we're going to have to rewrite all our code. There's all this complexity change that we have to take into account when we're making these projections. That doesn't mean we can't make projections. What it means is that the margin of error of our projections, or the confidence interval of our projections, becomes wider and wider, to the point where it's hard to make good business decisions based on those projections. And anyway, who has the data to calculate ROI for certain types of investments, at least? I like to think of the example of buying a firewall. So should we invest in buying a firewall? Well, if we're going to calculate the ROI for that firewall, we need to know things like, is it going to stop a hacker attack in the future? And did we already have something in our network that would have stopped the hacker attack anyway without the firewall? And what's the probability that that hacker attack is going to occur? And what are the consequences if it occurs? Is there data that a hacker is going to steal? If so, what data? And how much is it worth? And we don't know today all the data that we might have tomorrow. So what I'm getting at is to really do a calculation of the expected return on investment from an investment like that. You'd need all this information that just isn't close at hand. And it would probably cost you more to try to calculate the ROI than it would to buy the firewall. So I'm not sure ROI is right just for practical reasons as the measure of business value, but I think there are bigger conceptual problems with it. For example, let's say that we want to make an IT investment to reduce risk in some area. Well, what's the ROI of that risk reduction, right? Because it's a risk. We don't know if it's going to come true or not come true, right? We don't know the impact on cash flows or profit of the risk. Or if we decide to make IT investments to increase our agility or our resilience or our ability to respond to competitive threats or to seize opportunities that come up. Clearly, that sort of investment has business value, but you'll have a very hard time calculating an ROI for it. In fact, a better financial model really would be sort of like valuing options, making the investment a real option, or saying that it creates a real option, and then trying to value that real option. And options, their value depends on the amount of uncertainty. So that's probably a better model. But because we think of business value as having something to do with ROI, and because it's so hard to calculate ROI for some of these things, investments that increase agility, for example, well, of course, the predictable consequence is that we don't invest enough in that area. So let me make one more point about business value and the way that we normally think about it. And the best way for me to make this point is to tell you a little story. This is from my background when I was the CIO at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Department of Homeland Security. And I knew that we had organized in such a way that one of the business units, what we called service center operations, they had a lot of IT needs. So there was somebody we called the product owner from service center operations. And that person was responsible for formulating and prioritizing all of the IT initiatives that they wanted my IT organization to work on. And I also had somebody in my IT organization who was responsible for working with that product owner and helping to prioritize and helping to organize the backlog, essentially, of IT projects. And I asked them at one point how they were doing this prioritization, and they satisfied me. They said, you know, we're looking at the ROI of each project, and we're prioritizing the ones with the biggest ROI, and here's how we're thinking about the ROI, and so on. So I thought they're doing as well as one could do. I was at a meeting, a leadership meeting for the agency. It was the director of the agency and all of the leaders of the business units and so on. And the director of the agency was really worried about something. It turned out that our backlog for processing green card renewals was getting very long. Now, green card renewals they're easy, right? It's just a renewal. You just check to make sure the person has the green card, basically. And if so, you send them a new one. So it should take, almost no time. But we had a backlog, and the backlog was getting really long for this. And Congress was unhappy. The lobbyists were unhappy. The immigration lawyers were unhappy. Everybody was mad at us. And the director of the agency was feeling the heat. And this was his biggest priority, was to figure out a way to start reducing those backlogs. And walking out of the meeting, I talked to the head of the business unit that was responsible, which turned out to be Service Center Operations, that same group. And I said, I think we could be using technology to help a little bit on this. Let me check to see if we're doing something. And he thought that was a great idea. So I went to the two people who were managing the backlog, and I asked them which things on their backlog would help us get rid of the backlog, in the other sense, the long growing backlog for processing green card renewals. And they told me that there was nothing that they could think of on the backlog that was addressed at that. So we were in a strange position where the most strategic priority for the agency was to reduce that backlog. And we had a list of things to do that were prioritized by return on investment, but none of them had anything to do with the big strategic goal. Well, I think that's entirely possible, the way that we've thought of business value before, where a set of projects or requirements is proposed to the IT organization, and the priorities are decided among those things, but you don't know if anything among those things addresses the big priority. So that also felt to me like a wrong way to think about business value. The right way, to the extent that I could figure out a good way to do so, is to think of business value as cost effectively meeting the strategic imperatives as they're defined by the most senior leadership of the organization. So senior leadership has objectives. They've already decided that those are the most important objectives, so they've made some value decisions. But then once they've done that, the projects or the initiatives that add the most business value are the ones that help accomplish those imperatives. And it's not a matter of calculating ROIs and juggling them around and all of that. It's a matter of mapping imperatives into specific initiatives or requirements. Now, that leads to some interesting thoughts about IT organizations and how they fit into their broader companies. First of all, it means that the IT organization doesn't need to defer business value decisions to the business side of the organization. IT understands what the organization's strategic imperatives are just as well as anyone else. And so instead of being reactive and passive, the IT organization can start with a strategic imperative and go to the business side of the organization and say, okay, how are we going to work together to meet this imperative? So it could be a much more proactive approach. And to push this even further, in the digital world, it wouldn't be surprising if the IT organization is the one that has the good ideas about how to meet the strategic imperatives of the organization, right? A lot of it is done in the digital world, and having a really good understanding of it can help in creating innovative ideas to meet the strategic imperatives. So in a way, the rest of the organization should be helping IT to deliver the things with the most business value. I know that's a little bit of a reversal from the way that we're used to thinking about it. But now I think it's time for me to turn to bureaucracy. Bureaucracy. So we hate it, and that's a given. Or at least we think we do, at least. IT organizations, it turns out, manufacture quite a lot of bureaucracy in creating standards, in doing reviews of things, in setting up security rules, all kinds of other things like that, right? Now, first of all, that is bureaucracy, in fact. Secondly, it's bureaucracy because we need to do it, right? We, those of us who are in IT organizations, understand that these are important things. And you could say that about quite a lot of bureaucracy, that it is actually accomplishing things that are important. Now, we still hate it, but we have to start from that fact. In fact, you can actually say that bureaucracy sometimes adds business value. Now, that sounds a little bit strange, but one area I'm thinking of, for example, is around compliance. So with all the compliance frameworks that we're stuck with these days, Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, pretty much requires bureaucracy. It requires that you have rules that are always adhered to. It requires that certain people are accountable for executing those rules or overseeing those rules. You can't really be compliant without having a certain amount of bureaucracy. And in fact, being compliant is what lets you stay in business. So that's business value, right? Something that prevents you from going out of business probably is adding business value. Security rules help us stay secure. They're adding business value. So bureaucracy sometimes, not always, but sometimes manufactures business value. In fact, in a way, it's a manufacturing process. Bureaucracy manufactures compliance, and compliance has business value in many cases. Like any manufacturing process, bureaucracy is a value stream, and like any value stream, it should be lean. That's where things start to get interesting, right? Because what if we took our bureaucracy value stream and looked at it from a lean perspective and found all the places where it's not lean enough? In other words, the places where there's wasted effort, where we fill out more forms than are necessary, where we have more approvals than we actually need. Maybe there are places where we could automate the bureaucracy. Yeah, basically, we could just take a lean view of bureaucracy and use all the tools that we have from lean manufacturing and other lean techniques to improve it. My new book argues that there are really three things that we hate about bureaucracy. There are three characteristics that bureaucracy takes on, but doesn't need to, that are the things that cause us to hate it so much. So instead of bureaucracy being bloated, it can be lean, and we can make it so. Instead of bureaucracy petrifying, in other words, not changing, we can set up a bureaucracy to be learning and to take feedback and continuously improve itself. There's nothing in the nature of bureaucracy that says we can't do that. And instead of the bureaucracy being coercive, we can make it enabling, and in fact use bureaucracy as a way to enable autonomous teams and autonomous activities in an organization. If we could do those three things with our bureaucracy, it adds business value. So that's what my new book is about, and that's why I wrote it. So a topic that sounds as mundane as business value, and one that sounds even more mundane, bureaucracy, maybe are the keys to changing how we practice IT in the digital age. Even more so, as we come to value speed, agility, resilience, and of course, when I say value, I mean we believe it adds business value. A good understanding of what we mean by business value and what we mean by bureaucracy and how we can cope with it actually can help us thrive in the digital age. So for those who are in IT, I urge you to proactively think about business value. Don't just say, oh, that's something other people think about, right? It's actually part of your job, and the rest of the business is, in a way, is as clueless as you are on what's going to deliver business value. It's not obvious. It requires some thought. So if, as an IT practitioner, you take the lead in managing business value, then you earn yourself a seat at the table, which it turns out is the title of another book I wrote. Thanks for listening. Good luck.